Perfect. All right, everyone. Thank you very much for joining our first webinar for the 2023 season, the University of Minnesota Climate Adaptation Partnership Adaptation and Action webinar series. We're going to start this morning with just a few quick announcements just to pull us into the webinar, and then we will turn it over to our presenters for the day, Sharon Stevens and Amanda Farris, to talk about the Minnesota Climate Action Framework. So first of all, I just wanted to share a few tips about upcoming events. First of all, we have our webinar series now going monthly throughout most of the year. Up next month will be a presentation with the Nature Conservancy about the economics surrounding natural climate solutions. And then we'll continue to advertise and share webinars as they are fixed throughout the year. And then the other big announcement that we want to make sure is on your calendars is that we are in the process of finalizing the logistics for the return of the in-person University of Minnesota Climate Adaptation Partnership Conference. This year it will be the Midwest Climate Resilience Conference because we're actually going to do it in partnership with other states across the North Central region as sort of a Midwest Climate Adaptation Forum. It will be October 25th through 27th at the Duluth Entertainment and Convention Center in Duluth, Minnesota. So we hope to see many, many of you there. And then finally, we are actively on a variety of social media again. So I encourage you, if you've not already done so, to bop out into LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter, and you can find us there generally at UMN Climate or University of Minnesota Climate Adaptation Partnership. Is there something?
Nate, John Eaton raised his hand.
Yep. Is there something that, let's see, that we need to manage? Maybe you can throw it into the chat. In the meantime, I will keep going. The last quick update before we dive into the webinar is that if you are curious about University of Minnesota Climate Adaptation Partnership news and you're not already on our mail list, I encourage you to scan the QR code. We'll show that again at the end of the presentation, or you can visit z.umn.edu MCAP updates. And there's just a quick sign up form for our mail list that you can sign on to, and then you'll get news about upcoming webinars and other programs as we develop them. So a few friendly reminders. The webinar will begin as we have at noon. We'll end promptly at 1. All of you will be muted during the webinar, but as you can see, there's a Q&A at the bottom of the presentation. You can pop questions in there, and Jamie will be happy to, she'll be sort of helping to prioritize those and ferry them. And we are recording the webinar, and we'll post that on the YouTube channel at a later date. And finally, there are 2 ways that you can ask questions. You can both type in your own question in the Q&A box, or you can upvote questions that you'd really like to see answered. So as we go through the training today, we will, I encourage you to ask questions and upvote questions and keep it going, because that'll be the best way to have that interaction at the end of the presentation. So with that, I will stop sharing, and Sharon, we'll see if you are able to bop in and share your screen and unmute. Otherwise, we will slide to Amanda to get up first while hopefully we work in the back end to resolve tech issues.
Nate, I can go ahead and give a rundown of my presentation.
Perfect.
The way that we had set up this webinar, Sharon was going to give an overview of the Minnesota Climate Action Framework initially, and then I was going to share work that MCAP is doing to develop indicators and metrics to measure success in the framework. But Sharon's having a few technical difficulties, so I'll start, and then we'll provide additional context with Sharon's presentation during the second half of the webinar. So just a quick thumbs up that you guys can all see my screen. Good to go. Great. So again, my name is Amanda Farris. I'm the Senior Program Manager for the University of Minnesota Climate Adaptation Partnership. And today I'll be talking about a project that we're completing in collaboration with PCA to develop indicators and metrics as measures of success for the Climate Action Framework. So again, Sharon will be providing a little bit more of an in-depth overview of the framework in the next presentation, but just to give you a quick highlight, Minnesota, the governor released the Climate Action Framework in September of last year. And the framework envisions a state that is carbon neutral, resilient, and equitable. It's organized around 6 primary goals: clean transportation, healthy lives and communities, clean energy and efficient buildings, the clean economy, and climate smart lands, as well as resilient communities. And so I'm helping to lead a project in collaboration with Sharon and MPCA to identify climate resilience indicators and metrics that will help us to track progress in implementing the initiatives and action steps that are outlined in the framework, with a focus on specifically the resilient communities chapter in the report. So Sharon will be talking a little bit more about the significant investments that the state is making to both mitigate the impacts of climate change as well as adapt to our changing climate. And we want to be able to demonstrate the progress and mark our successes in achieving those goals. But why do we want to measure success? So measuring resilience and adaptation progress, although difficult, can provide a number of benefits to both the state and to Minnesotans on the whole. First and foremost, these measures provide a tangible way to communicate success to Minnesotans and demonstrate the benefits of the framework. It allows state agencies to track both successes and pain points, so they're able to iteratively refine plans and investments for longer term success. So thinking about these initiatives and action steps in the framework, and maybe they might need to be modified along the way. These indicators and metrics can help us identify points when we need to do that. They also provide better accountability in government by helping to demonstrate efforts, accomplishments, and progress towards the state's goals. So even if we do miss targets, then we can measure and help maintain transparency and build trust in the work that we're doing. From a financial perspective, groups like Moody's are continuously using and beginning to use how states are preparing for climate change as a measure of government credit rating. So these indicators and metrics can help to improve those broader impacts for the state. They can also illustrate to potential funders why one investment might be better than another during a competitive grant process. And they can document how funds are being spent and to what effect when we do secure funding through grants and the like. And they also provide us ways to improve adaptation strategies. So adaptation is a new field. And as we work to establish best practices, these measures and indicators and metrics can help us to do that. And how we measure successful resilience. So the project specifically that we're working on is developing indicators and metrics, indicators being reference tools that can be used to regularly assess the status or rates of change and trends. And this can help us to improve our understanding, our communications, and to inform decision-making. So indicators as a broad measure of success are systematically updated and comparative to a baseline of change. So we might use as an example the Green Step Cities program, and adding capacity through additional staffing or funding support would be an indication and pointing to a commitment to invest in a program that has a proven track record of supporting climate adaptation and resilience in local Minnesota communities. Metrics, on the other hand, are variables that can be measured and tracked more specifically that represent success for broader indicators. So using our Green Step Cities examples, metrics might be the number of communities participating in the program, the different types of communities that are participating, or the number and types of different staff positions that have been created to support the position, or excuse me, the program. And so now I'm giving you a general sense of what we're doing and why we're doing it. And I'll dig a little bit more into the methods and the progress on this project to date. So first, we started with an audit of other states that have developed indicators and metrics. We identified a set of states for the audit based on states that are leading the way in this process, the geographic distribution of those states, as well as looking at the different processes that the states have used to develop their indicators and metrics. We identified the source documents where the indicators and metrics are called out. Mostly these are state climate adaptation plans and related reports, but they're also included in some local government documents that we analyzed. So we analyzed the documents to learn more about the processes by which the indicators and metrics were created and prioritized, the individual metrics and indicators themselves and what they're intended to measure, information about how the indicators and metrics are being monitored and tracked, as well as who the key audiences are for sharing progress and successes. And we compiled a complete list of all of these indicators and metrics, over 150, which are allowing us to associate other states' indicators and metrics to initiatives and actions in Minnesota's plan, so we can think about what others have developed and how we might transfer those to Minnesota as well. So we narrowed the audit down to 6 states, including Colorado, Maine, Maryland, Massachusetts, Michigan, and North Carolina, based on those criteria I mentioned previously. And we're learning overall that states are prioritizing their indicators based on these climate action plans at the state level and evaluating the goals that are set forth in those plans and demonstrating progress to state residents. This is very similar to the approach Minnesota is taking. These indicators and metrics are often developed to be scalable, so they're serving as a reference guide not only for the state, but ways that local governments can track their progress as well. But because many of the states are still in the early stages of these indicators and metrics development, there's less information about how effective they actually are in measuring. So we're all learning together through this process. But we do see examples of how they're being effectively monitored and communicated via things like online resiliency dashboards and tracking systems. So just a few highlights from some of our findings. I won't go through all the states, but just wanted to mention a couple of things. Colorado is by far the furthest along. They actually developed their resiliency framework back in 2015 and updated the framework in 2020. They, similar to Minnesota, have 6 main focus areas, and the statewide indicators and metrics are designed to assess success around each of those focus areas. And Colorado really used an extensive stakeholder engagement process as they worked to not only identify the focus areas, the initiatives in their framework, as well as the indicators and metrics to really show meaningful progress and success in their communities. These state level indicators and metrics are publicly accessible via their online dashboard, and they're designed to help answer 3 primary questions. What makes a community more resilient? Which indicators are most important for different communities? So not all the same, not created equal. And also, how are they tracking progress around resilient strategies at both the state and the local level? So Colorado has taken this additional step of creating a community resilience assessments and actions guide using the framework as a framework. They've identified 50 indicators and actions that align with the state framework for local governments. Maryland is taking a slightly different approach. They have a 10-year plan for adaptation implementation, but they also simultaneously created this Maryland Coastal Adaptation Report Card. The report card includes 15 indicators in 4 categories, and it was designed to assess the current state of resilience when it was published in 2022. So the report card provides this baseline against which Maryland can measure and assess their progress over time. You can see from the graphic here, they scored a B- in their initial assessment. You can see the color coding on the different indicators show where they're doing well and where they need improvements, namely in repetitive loss properties and critical facilities. And then finally, Michigan is a third example of a different development process. They started, work in Michigan started with a local action plan. So the Marquette Area Climate and Health Adaptation Guidebook was developed specifically for Marquette County. It consists of 3 volumes, one of them being specific to the development of indicators and metrics, and those are aligned with specific policy recommendations. So they're looking at climate drivers and impacts, associated policies to address those, and then measures of success that align really nicely in a table format in the document. So now the state, which has developed a statewide healthy climate plan, is using that example to scale up to indicators and metrics at the statewide level. So clearly there's more than one way to crack this nut. So what can we learn from these other states about developing metrics for Minnesota? So we're actually now mapping all of these individual indicators and metrics to the initiatives and action steps in the Minnesota Resilient Communities goals. And we're doing that across 3 main categories. First, we're looking at the focus areas of the initiatives in the Minnesota Action Plan, and we're matching those to metrics with similar focus areas from the other states. For example, we could consider the number of clean energy jobs that are created as a metric of success for the Minnesota initiative to support resilience through local and regional economic development and community energy transition. We're also looking at scale to think about the indicators and metrics that might be most appropriate based on the scale of the Minnesota initiative. So for example, Minnesota is looking to ensure that new development is outside of high-risk flood areas, and this could be monitored and tracked by the number of repetitive lost properties in the state. So that's at a building-specific scale. And then we're also looking at which hazards the initiatives are intended to address. For example, we might think about the number of residents that have been reached by weatherization awareness efforts and using that as a metric to monitor progress in the Minnesota initiative to identify areas where people are at greatest risk of climate impacts and where they live. So as a next step, we have circulated a data collection spreadsheet to the different state agencies who are involved in the initiatives and action steps for the Resilient Communities chapter. We're collecting information about available data sets that they have, and both the state agencies. We're also looking at national data sets that have Minnesota specific data, because we want to use existing data that would help us track these indicators and metrics. We don't want to create additional requirements or burdens to track new or different information. So if you know of any data sets that might be useful, I'll include contact information at the last slide of the presentation. We'd be happy to hear from you. We're also going to be using that information to have interviews with our state agency representatives. We'll be discussing the data sets that they have, how they're currently tracking their own progress, the initiatives and actions that they're involved in with the Resilient Communities chapter, and how they envision their available data being useful to track their progress. And then in April, we'll actually be meeting with PCA leadership and other state agency representatives to look at our initial list of recommendations for indicators and metrics. We'll be going through a prioritization process to develop a final list, and we'll be providing that in a project report by the end of June, which is when this project is scheduled to end. And we hope that the findings from this effort that are focused on the Resilient Communities chapter would be able to be used for the other goal chapters in the Minnesota framework as well. So I think that that is all that I have for now. I will pause sharing my screen and see if we might be able to pop over to Sharon for her portion of the presentation.
We also have a few.
Can you all hear me? All
Yes,
right.
Sharon, we can.
Sorry for the interesting camera difficulties. It was working this morning just fine, and then 10 minutes before we all, I was 2%. It decided to go on holiday. So I'm going to share my screen, and you'll have the lovely narration of my voice throughout this presentation. Hi everyone, I'm Sharon Stevens. I work for the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. I help to coordinate the Resiliency and Adaptation Action Team under the Governor Walsh's Climate Change Subcabinet. I serve as the Adaptation Coordinator for the agency, focusing primarily on external relations, policy recommendations, particularly interagency work. I also serve as liaison with the U.S. Climate Alliance Resiliency Working Group, and I also work with the Great Lakes Commission Resiliency Standing Committee. So I'm very happy to be presenting a little bit about the Minnesota's Climate Action Framework and specifically information about the resilience sections thereof. So let me share my screen. Oh, it says host disabled participant screen sharing. And I did enter as a panelist. So is there a way you can authorize me to share my screen?
Try it now, Sharon.
Okay. All right, now let me get to my slide deck, which is interesting because, okay, slideshow from the beginning. All right, so can you see my slide deck? It should say climate action at work.
Yes, we can see it. Thank you.
All right, wonderful. All right. So I'm going to basically give you a drive-by view of what the Climate Action Framework is all about. This is actually the cover of our Climate Action Framework. You can find this if you go to the website Our Minnesota Climate and then put in Minnesota Climate Action Framework. When you do that, you'll see that the framework is actually composed of 5 parts. The actual framework itself, which is a narrative version of our goals, our initiatives, sub-initiatives. And then you have a second section called state action steps. These are the specific action steps to implement the various different initiatives to achieve our goals. There will be a greenhouse gas emissions analysis, a glossary, and a list of acronyms. And then finally, which I think is very useful, is a summary of input that we received from a wide number of stakeholders, including a series of working groups around each of the goals who were involved in reviewing the latest draft of the framework. We had a series of meetings where they analyzed the recommendations, showed us where we were missing the gaps, and came up with additional policy recommendations. I wanted to give you an idea of what that looked like, because oftentimes this is overlooked when people talk about the framework. So this is an example of the Resilient Communities State Action Steps. And we'll be coming back to this in a little bit, but I wanted to show you that we have sub-initiatives, we have state action steps on each side, and then we have on the side, on the right-hand side, we have 3 columns, whether the state agencies would be leading that work, whether we'll be working with the legislature to enact legislation, or whether we're going to be partnering with others to encourage that work. So if you were to open up the framework, you would see that we have this contents. And so we'll have a vision statement, executive summary. We'll have some preliminary work that talks about, why we are where we are, the opportunity we have in Minnesota, and then the important role that tribes play and have continued to play. In fact, the tribes have been ahead of the game for decades in working with climate and adaptation and resilience. And then you see the various 5 goals. So the vision for our state that the governor wanted to set out was carbon neutral, resilient, equitable. And by that, we mean we want to have 200, by 2015, we will have substantially reduced greenhouse gases. And then we wanted to make sure our Minnesota communities, businesses, and natural environments are able to prepare to recover from the impacts of climate change, so all Minnesotans can thrive in the face of these challenges. Now, finally, we want to make sure that our policy recommendations, our state action steps, our legislation is equitable, because Minnesotans, we know that underserved communities are often bearing the brunt of the impacts of climate change. And so we want to make sure that the solution we're offering will be able to serve those most in need. Again, reduce greenhouse gases by 2050, and most importantly, why we're here today, is we want to prioritize resilience investment over the next 10 years. And this is particularly important because this is consistent with what the Intergovernmental Panel came out in their latest report on climate change in February of 2022, which said that adaptation does work, but you have to plan it carefully. And you need to make those investments primarily within the next 10 years, because after that time, the opportunities for significant change will dramatically be reduced. So now's the time we no longer kick the can down the road to invest in our communities to help them prepare for climate change and build resilience. So the key messages of the entire framework is that it's happening now. We have to accelerate the work that we're doing. It affects everyone, but some are definitely hit harder. We need to work together to make this happen. And we have also a tremendous opportunity to grow our economy and improve our health and equity and the environment through the process. So here are our 6 goals: clean transportation, climate smart natural and working lands, resilient communities, clean energy and efficient buildings, healthy lives and communities, and a clean economy. So let's talk about resilient communities. Resilient communities is the 3rd goal. The vision is that we want communities to have the resources and the support to plan and implement projects to build a resilient future. And we want to make sure the physical infrastructure, natural systems, and are prepared for climate impacts and can even recover from extreme events. The challenges is that communities are not cookie cutter. They experience impacts differently because based upon where they are and who their constituencies are. The solutions must be tailored to each community's need. They need to be in the driver's seat because they can best determine what is most important for their particular community. So what are we recommending? So we have 3 primary initiatives. 1, we want climate smart communities, build community capacity to protect against and withstand the effects of climate change. And how do we do that? The sub-initiatives include provide technical assistance, tools, maps, and data, particularly climate-related data. We want to make sure that they have access to funding so they can be able to start doing this now. And we want to be able to share best practices through various different networks. Again, as I said, we have the summary of climate actions. And so this is an example of the climate actions for that first initiative for climate smart communities. So for like sub-initiative 3.1.1, provide needed technical tools and data. We have a list of all of the specific state action steps to help us achieve that particular initiative. If you look, for example, for shared best practices for learning networks, you'll see the first one is increased capacity of the Green Steps Cities program to develop and share resilience best practices and expand their pilot programs to include more tribal nations, schools, counties, and even townships. And I'm very proud to see the second one, which you all should be very interested to see, is engage with the Minnesota Climate Adaptation Partnership and other partners, provide climate modeling data, technical assistance, and adaptation strategies. The second initiative under resilient communities is we want healthy community green spaces and water resources. We need to expand and protect our tree canopies, our urban forestries, our parks, other green spaces, and we want to make sure that our lakes and rivers and wetlands are protected because they provide community resilience benefits. So how do we do that? Again, expand community tree plantings and tree preservation. We need to protect against emerald ash borer and be able to plant trees that are adaptive to the increasing change in temperature. And we want to be able to protect and improve water quality and quantity. Chief among them in the state action steps for this initiative is implement the state water plan that was approved 2 years ago, and as a fundamental way to increase resilience throughout Minnesota. And then finally, the third initiative, we want resilient buildings, infrastructure, and businesses. And how do we do that? Well, we need to plan for climate adaptation and our resilience and commercial developments. We need to make sure we have various funding solutions to fund bringing up to speed resilient infrastructure, critical facilities. If we have a water treatment right next to a river, well, we may need to move that maybe a few spaces further up north or further up south. We need to be able to plan for this, and it does cost money, not only in the planning, but in the design, and then finally in the implementation. We want to have green infrastructure, as well as a wide variety of stormwater management. We don't want to limit ourselves to just green infrastructure, because when we're dealing with stormwater, we need to have solutions that include both green and gray infrastructure. We want to be able to reduce the urban heat island effect. Even small towns have that urban heat island effect. We recently had a celebration in Faribault in southern Minnesota, where we were talking about the steps that city were taking to reduce the urban heat island effect. And they were planting trees in their downtown area because they saw what a difference that could make. And then finally, businesses need to be involved in the solution. So we need to basically support adaptation for them as well. So how are we going to measure how successfully we move the needle? Well, we have measures of progress. These are broad-based goals, but we have the three that we've selected for resilience communities are: by 2030, 100% of Minnesota's local, tribal, and regional governments have individual or regional plans that assess climate vulnerability and have begun implementing climate adaptation actions. Now, this doesn't mean they all have to have a plan that's labeled vulnerability assessment or a plan that's labeled adaptation plan. It can be part of comprehensive planning. It can be part of a regional plan. We're going to give communities wide latitude to then adapt the plans that they have in place if those plans help us build resiliency. The second measurement of progress is that we would like to not only maintain our overall statewide tree canopy cover, but increase it to 30% by 2030 and 40% by 2050. Now, we're going to do this by establishing regional specific targets that factor in tree loss, but we're also going to make sure that we have equity-focused implementation. And obviously, those communities that are in the northern part of Minnesota will have not as much to gain because they're already heavily forested in some areas, but those in the southern part of Minnesota definitely have a ways to go if they want to increase their tree canopies. And then finally, another target is by 2026, we have funding approved for implementing at least 25 on-the-ground adaptation projects that address climate vulnerabilities and increase community resiliency. None of these projects can happen overnight. They take years, which is one of the reasons why we need to start now in that process. And then you'll note, I just want to give a tip of the hat to Amanda and the work that the Minnesota Climate Alliance Partnership is doing, Adaptation Partnership is doing in helping us identify Minnesota-specific resilient metrics. And we are going to be having a workshop in late April where we're going to be prioritizing those specific resilient metrics that have been identified and make sure that they are aligned with the climate action frameworks initiatives and our specific action steps. So let's get to the good stuff. How much money are we going to be looking for? Well, here are some highlights of the Resilient Communities budget request. So for the PCA, We are proposing a Resilient Communities Grants and Technical Assistance Program, and the governor has approved asking for $174 million for the biennium to do this. That is $86.94 million for each of the next 2 years. We are going to be hoping to work with this legislation in the near future with our various different advocates and representatives and senators. So keep an eye out for that. DNR is going to be recommending $15.2 million for the Community Relief Program to help support tree canopy and urban forestry. PCA is also wanting to expand our Green Step program. That again is aligned with our state action steps, and they're asking for $380,000 per year to do that. PCA is also very much interested in supporting our tribes and is recommending a technical assistance program specifically for them at $4 million per year. And then finally, our Commerce Department is proposing a Strengthening Minnesota Homes program, helping individual homeowners fortify their homes against extreme weather, and also working with the insurance industry to lower their premiums for those who do so at $32.5 million. Talking a little bit about that grant program, what is it going to be doing? Well, obviously, we want to be able to provide funding for our local communities. And we're going to say it can be a local government, it can be an organization who's partnering with the government, it can be a tribal government, it can be a nonprofit. We want to make sure that, we have funding available for the planning and design construction of wastewater and stormwater resiliency projects. We want to look at energy efficiency, for example, infrastructure, especially green infrastructure, mitigation of floods, obviously continuity of service during critical severe weather events, and green space projects. And then most importantly, that is hand in hand with all of this is the technical assistance to help communities do their design and analysis and their assessment of these projects. Now, the technical assistance that we're talking about is a specific need in not only assessing the risk and adaptation prioritization, but how to use climate data and other available resources. And then how to apply for some of these federal funds that are coming down the pike. It's that lack of capacity and technical expertise that's really a stumbling block for so many communities of why federal funding is not always applied for. So we want to help to remove that barrier. Now for the tribe, we also want to provide technical support to them, grant writing assistance, environmental science or engineering assistance. There's a tremendous amount of funding with the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act and the IRA to advance community resilience within our tribes. Now, a little bit about Commerce Strengthening American Minnesota Homes. It's basically building resiliency home by home. They're taking their calling card from what Alabama did, and you're using that as the model for Minnesota. IIBHS is, it's the building and housing standard for risk reduction. It is an industry group that is promoting fortifying community homes against extreme weather. And if you add that fortification with insurance premium reduction, you really have a great out of the gates, lead in leading in resilience at a home by home basis. Now, resilience is also in other parts of the framework, not just in resilient communities. So in goal 2, climate smart and natural lands, while most of that work covers mitigation, greenhouse gas reduction, as well as carbon sequestration, it also has very specific resilient provisions. They want to expand climate resilient agriculture and forestry. They want to increase water storage and infiltration to manage damages, drainage, and there are various different soil health funding and best practices recommendations. They have, very specific working lands requests. So agriculture is recommending $4 million for soil health equipment grants. And Bowser has requested $27 million for soil health practice acceleration. Then goal 5 is healthy lives in communities. And they also have resilience components within their initiatives and state action steps, 2 of which involve strengthening public drinking water systems. So they have $16 million requested for that. And they also have another $12.75 million to help them assess public health climate resiliency. So what is next? Well, obviously, we want to be able to show how the climate action framework will be used to accelerate this action. We are in the process of driving budget and policy development. We know we have to measure and report progress. We are going to be held accountable for what we have set out to do. And here are our priorities. We want to have impact. We want to have equity. We need to have economy, and we want to make sure we have health and environment. So I want to thank you for the time that you shared with me today. I'm happy to answer questions. Again, I'm sorry I was only able to add narration to this and not give you a camera, but I hope I was able to answer some of your questions about what our plans are for resilient communities in Minnesota.
Thanks so much, Sharon. And thank you also, Amanda. That was wonderful. And Nate or Amanda, if you have anything to add, feel free to jump in. But otherwise, I've got compiled a bunch of questions that from the audience, from the Q&A that we can take. And also feel free to add more questions in there as we go. So first, I have some questions, Amanda, for you from your presentation. And 2 of them, one from Paul Gronberg and another from Anonymous. They are wondering about success. And Paul is asking, are you assuming success, or why are you, and what is defined as success? It seems to me that you are measuring change. And some of that might be cleared up too from Sharon's presentation as well.
Yeah, and Sharon, please feel free to jump in. I think, Paul, that we do want to assume success. I think that we want to start with an optimistic view that we're going to be able to rise to the challenge that climate change presents to us. And Minnesota is moving in leaps and bounds with the establishment of this action framework. So this process of developing indicators and metrics, the question about defining success versus measuring change, I think that it is measuring change because these initiatives and action steps, as Sharon mentioned, it's going to take years to implement these. And so we are going to have to measure progress over time, and it will be measuring change to some extent, but hopefully change in the right direction and change in creating communities and infrastructure that is more resilient to some of the extremes that we're experiencing, whether that's the heavy precipitation events or and flooding that's related to that, some of our extreme winter conditions, things like that. So yes, it is change over time, but ultimately we are looking to monitor and track some of these successes. Unfortunately, sometimes I think we might need to see an extreme event and how we're able to better respond to an event based on some of these implemented strategies. We certainly don't wish for that, but in some cases, that is how we might document successful implementation. So, and I wanted to mention Susie Clark, who is a postdoctoral associate with the MCAP team, is on the call today, and she's partnering with me on this project. So Susie, I would welcome you to chime in, and Sharon, if you have anything to add.
I think you've got it, Amanda.
Sounds good.
Let me just go ahead and just say that, and Amanda may have already covered this in her earlier presentation, but in essence, there are 2 types of resilient metrics. There are what we call process metrics, how many grants were applied for, and how many communities have an adaptation plan. Those are process metrics. And then there are outcome metrics. How successful are we able to build resilience and prevent the extreme events of extreme weather. So those are harder to get your arms around because they take longer to demonstrate, because this cannot be done overnight. And so a perfect example of of why it's a challenge is that Rochester, the city of Rochester in southeast Minnesota, they've had a number of floods over the years. And so they decided to invest a few years ago in millions of dollars in upgrading their their stormwater system, and they did a variety of specific actions to limit that flooding. So when there was a major flood a couple of years ago that otherwise would have basically flooded a third of the city, that didn't happen. They were able to save millions and millions of dollars of what would have been damage because of that investment that they did. But how do you measure a negative? And so that's one of the reasons why this is a challenge. And while the 3 measures of progress we have may seem broad, they're only a starting point, which is one of the reasons why we're working with the Minnesota Climate Adaptation Partnership to develop very specific metrics aligned with our state action steps and our various initiatives and sub-initiatives.
Oh, thank you, Sharon, and thank you, Amanda and Susie as well. That's a great answer. And I have one more. I have 4 more questions and one more from Timothy Nolan. He's asking, the framework does not appear to address the industrial sector. How can that be? And this also might have been covered more by Sharon as well, but feel free to either of you answer.
Well, the framework actually it is not the complete recipe for all the solutions. It is an example of some of the work that Minnesota should be doing, but by no means is the only amount of work. And you are absolutely correct. The industrial sector is a vital partner in this. And so in the greenhouse gas reductions, obviously we looked at the various different components, including industrial, that would be contributing to our greenhouse gases. And they also will be hopefully contributing to the reduction of those gases. So we looked at transportation, we looked at agriculture, and we also looked at, electricity production, but you are absolutely correct. More work needs to be done. And I know we're looking forward to making that happen.
Oh, thank you, Sharon. And I have 3 more questions here. One is from Mary Ellen Hearn. I'm curious, are you looking at an alignment effort with the UN Sustainable Development Goals eventually?
Oh, absolutely. I think that's very important. And as I said, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is really the hallmark of the best available science and recommendations. And we specifically made sure that our framework was aligned with the IPCC.
Oh, thank you. That's awesome. I've got 2 more questions here. This one's from Michael Overend, and we've had a bit of a discussion in the Q&A. He's got some really good points and questions. So he's asking, I'm wondering if your MCAP mission includes informing Minnesota state legislators regarding environmental and climate issues. It's obvious that legislators are asked to create policy based on a wide range of personal knowledge regarding these topics, and that they are also overwhelmed by the sheer volume of diverse policy that they need to act on in their brief legislative sessions. Is MCAP seeking to provide a nonpartisan source of information and resources to all Minnesota state legislators to provide them with the unbiased information that they can use to create sound policy decisions? So basically asking more about MCAP's mission and specifically regarding legislators.
Yeah, Jamie, and thank you for your response to Michael in the Q&A there. And so yes, we are providing information to the legislator, as Jamie mentioned in her response. Heidi Roop, our director, did testify in front of the legislature a few weeks ago, providing information about climate change across the state. I think that you make a great point, and a lot of times these policies are developed with imperfect information, but that's why we rely on expertise and resources that are available for our agencies, for the universities, to help inform those decisions. And MCAP is certainly hoping to be one of those resources as well. So Nate, I don't know if you as Associate Director of MCAP had anything to add to that prompt as well.
No, I think you've got it covered. I would just expand and say that I think we at MCAP are trying to be an unbiased source of high quality climate data and information for all of Minnesota's vulnerable sectors and communities. So certainly that includes legislators, but as Sharon talked about, also serving communities that are developing resilience plans. Jamie is working with our forestry community. We're working with the agricultural community. So really trying to make sure that we can provide as much unbiased information, tools, and high quality data as we can to the people who need it.
And I would just like to jump in and say that Dr. Heidi Roop is highly respected among my senior agency leaders. She did a great job testifying before several House committees related to a lot of these issues. And then our Assistant Commissioner for Climate and Policy, Frank Kolash, also was testifying in the last couple of weeks to several government committees about the framework and about the opportunities that are present in funding the governor's budget. And so we understand and absolutely value the need to educate and provide recommendations to our legislators, who ultimately have the decision of how we're going to be funded, and we're guardedly optimistic that that those funds will be passed and the governor can sign them.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, thank you to all of you. Those are really exciting answers. I have actually two more questions now. One more popped in. One is from Stacy Myers. Do the resiliency grants apply to drinking water utilities?
There will be a separate set of funds that are going to be available for utilities. And of course, I mentioned the Department of Health with, the $16 million that they have for drinking water infrastructure. So that's going to be there. There's also additional funding provided by EPA that will be available to facilities. And so, so our particular grants will not necessarily be exclusively for them, but there are several pots of money available, including potentially part of the resiliency grants. But we first want to make sure we have available the other funding that's specifically directed towards drinking infrastructure resilience.
Oh, thanks, Sharon. And Nate, I'm going to throw this last one in here, and hopefully it's really quick, and then we'll move on to Nate's going to wrap things up with a few more slides. And so this is from Anonymous. Is there a corresponding climate mitigation network? I'm assuming this is in relation to like MCAP.
Yeah. And I don't think there is a one-to-one translation of a climate mitigation partnership to the climate adaptation partnership, and that's due in part to the history of how the adaptation partnership formed. But there are a variety of groups working on mitigation efforts across the university and across Minnesota. One group that I would encourage everyone to look at if you're interested in a similar kind of network focused on mitigation is the University of Minnesota's Clean Energy Resource Teams. They do a lot of mitigation focused work around the energy sector and are a good model for that kind of work. And with that, I will, I guess, open it up. Amanda or Susie or Jamie, anything that I missed there on mitigation? I didn't miss like the statewide mitigation network that I don't know about, right?
I can go quickly just jump in,
Yeah.
on the adaptation side. This actually, cities have been in the forefront of communicating with each other about mitigation. And they've been doing it for the last 10 years. And so, so around them have built additional networks for communication and with various different nonprofit partners. So there are some informal networks, and there are those networks that are also exclusively for local units of government. But what we have here at MCAP is truly extraordinary, with the focus primarily on resilience and adaptation. And we value it highly.
Thank you, Sharon. Well, with that, I want to, in turn, extend a congratulations to you and the Resilience and Adaptation Action team that you worked with on that chapter. And I wanted to point out to everyone, I did put in the chat a quick link. The Resilience and Adaptation Action team that involves over 15 different state agencies, departments, groups, and a whole host of advisors that collaborated to develop the Resilient Communities goal chapter and other resilience and adaptation content for the state framework that we heard about today was actually a winner of a Minnesota Climate Adaptation Award earlier this year. So I would encourage you to applaud them for that incredible work. And you can visit the site that we linked to learn more. And then in just the few moments remaining, again, I wanted to remind you that if you're curious about staying up on news from the Minnesota Climate Adaptation Partnership, please visit z.umn.edu/MCAP updates and sign up for the newsletter to learn more, or follow us on social media. And then one other opportunity I wanted to share on behalf of Jamie is that we are working this year to begin a new statewide extension program for community climate leaders, where we'll focus on providing some deep understanding about Minnesota's changing climate, potential climate adaptation strategies and solutions, and equipping interested community members with the skills and abilities to work individually and with others to advance community climate solutions. So right now, we're really interested in gathering as much information as we can about how to design that program well and to suit your interests. So again, I'd encourage you to do one of three things. You can zap the QR code if you're really fast. You can visit z.umn.edu/climate leaders interest. And those will both take you to a really short survey that you can fill out to let us know what you're interested in. Or the last one is if you have any questions about the presentation today, including what was that link for the Community Climate Leaders program that I totally want to fill out, please feel free to email us at mnclimate@umn.edu. And that includes, there have been a few questions about getting slide presentations or the slides from our presentations today. Those will be on YouTube soon, but if you do need the specific slides for any reason, you can shoot us an email and we'll try to get you there. And then the last thing for today before we close down is that we will send you an email with a link to a short survey for your feedback about this webinar presentation. Please do us a favor and fill it out. It helps us understand who's participating in the presentation and how we can continue to improve the presentation for you.
And Nathan, if you don't, as we wrap up, just want to remind everybody, you can take a look at the framework and download a copy for yourself by going again to our Minnesota Climate website, and then the framework will be right there on that page with links to all the sections. So again, I want to thank you for allowing us to share what the framework is all about and how we are helping our communities build resilience.
Thanks everyone for participating today. And with that, I'm going to stop the recording, and you are free to go on your way and have a wonderful day and a good weekend. Good luck with the snow if you're in that area.